Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
It's President's Day today, but since we already cover our current president quite a bit in our coverage of whatever news is happening in a given week, I'd like to take a step back and consider one particular theme that relates to Black History Month. In the 19th century, the hierarchy in the United States ran from the president on down to the slave. And while slavery has been abolished, we're still dealing with racial and ethnic hierarchies today. One context we're experiencing the injustice of these hierarchies today is in the worship industry. This September, I'm going to have my first book published with Broadleaf Books. It's titled Weapons of Worship: How the Songs of Evangelicalism Form the Soundtrack of Extremism. One of the storylines I cover in the book is how racial hierarchies during the Civil War shaped white worship music differently than black spirituals, and then how those hierarchies evolved over the next century and a half into what we're seeing today. So for today's episode, I'd like to explore how the worship industry creates hierarchies that strengthen the power of white Christians while dehumanizing and exiling black Christians. When we go back to the Civil War, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is how popular music was during the Civil War and the role that music played. In fact, Union General Philip Sheridan said, "Music has done its share and more than its share in winning this war." And Confederate General Robert E. Lee said, "I don't think we could have an army without music." And so you had the North and you had the South, and there were some songs that appealed to one or the other, and there were some songs that could appeal to either side. For example, you may have heard the song Stand Up for Jesus. The lyrics of this song say, stand up for Jesus, ye soldiers of the cross. Lift high his royal banner, it must not suffer loss. From victory unto victory his army shall he lead, till every foe is vanquished, and Christ is Lord indeed." So you could see how these lyrics could be adapted by either side, the North or the South. It's about soldiers who are standing up and they're marching from one victory to another victory until they defeat all of their foes. It's creating a power dynamic over your enemies, but it's also vague enough to where either side could apply it. During the recruitment process, the soldiers could use another song whose lyrics said, "The call to arms is sounding, the foemen muster strong, while saints beneath the altar are crying, Lord, how long? The living and the loving Christ's royal standard raise, and marching on to conflict shout forth their captain's praise." Again, you're calling people to arms. And so it's about this warrior mentality, defeating your enemies, but it's also vague enough to where either side could do it. Both sides could also sing something like "Onward Christian soldiers marching as to war with the cross of Jesus going on before." Everybody thinks that their cause is the cause of the cross. You know, who's going to say I'm against the cross if you're in some kind of a Christian community? And so, again, you're identifying as a soldier, you're going to war, and the cross is the purpose that you're fighting for. But then there were some songs that resonated with one side of the war. So soldiers in the North might sing something like, "Mighty ruler, all commanding, reigning from thy heavenly throne, forth to earth thy spirit sending, winning conquests for thy son, lead our armies till rebellion be cast down." The South was rebelling, they were known as the rebels. It's asking God, Jesus, to lead the armies of the North in order to cast down the rebels of the South. Also, the Star-Spangled Banner was a song that Christians actually sang during worship services during this time. And there was another verse that was added that included the lines, "Down, down with the traitor who dares to defile the flag of her stars and the page of her story." It says, "If a foe from within strike a blow at her glory." So, these are lyrics that are from the perspective of the Northern soldiers wanting to strike down the traitors in the South. But then there were songs that resonated with Confederate soldiers. For example, "God Save the South" said, "War to the hilt, theirs be the guilt, who fetter the free man to ransom the slave." And then there were also songs that originally resonated with soldiers from the North. For example, one said, "The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah, down with the traitors and up with the stars." Again, it's saying down with the traitors in the South. But then the South changed the lyrics of that song to "Our Dixie forever, she's never at a loss, down with the eagle and up with the cross." And so you can see how the perspective, even in white-dominated communities, the lyrics of their worship was shaped by their social perspective in relation to the Civil War. But all of these are white contexts, primarily, where they're basically creating worship music that varies and evolves depending on how the war is going for them. But they're all kind of sharing the similar language of, we are soldiers and we are here conquering for the purpose of the cross. On the other hand, you have black communities. Black Christians during this time were not concerned about conquering their neighbors and exercising dominion over them. They had a completely different set of concerns because the soundtrack of the empire is different from the soundtrack of the exile. The soundtrack of the president is different from the soundtrack of the slave. So while white communities would sing in public about conquering, black communities had to sing in private about liberation. James Cone, the black liberationist theologian, said that the theme of and the central concept of the black spirituals was divine liberation of the oppressed from slavery. And this had to be done in secret. They couldn't meet publicly. Eileen Gunther talks about in her book, In Their Words, Slave Life and the Power of the Spirituals. She said, it was not Sunday morning worship with their masters that nourished the spirit of the slaves, but their secret meetings. The meetings held in secret places out of earshot of the overseers and owners were times of genuine faith and real worship, places of respite, protest, self-expression, creativity, and building community. She said locations varied. In a distant cabin, under a clump of trees, or in a distant gully. Slaves risked punishment if they were caught in such meetings. Children might be stationed in treetops as lookouts to whistle a warning should an overseer come close to their meeting place. Participants also hung wet quilts on overturned iron pots in order to mute the sound of their praying and singing. You see this fundamental contrast, not only in whether they're singing in public or in private, but also they're having to sing in ways that are muted. They're not able to be outwardly expressive of what they're feeling. Christian McWhorter talked about how they had to sing with wash bins over their heads so that the master couldn't hear them. They had these gatherings known as hush harbors. Imani Perry talks about how it was an alternative space of recognition to be seen and to see others and to witness others and be engaged in a mutuality that comes through shared testimonies and exchange of ideas. These all had to be done quietly. And also, the content of their songs were different. Again, while the white communities were singing about being soldiers who were conquering the rebels, the black Christians were singing code songs. They were code songs that would use the imagery in Scripture to pursue liberation for themselves today and to identify themselves with those stories. For example, Eileen Gunther says, the unlocking of the biblical code is fairly obvious. Egypt, Babylon, or hell referenced the land of enslaved people, or more specifically, being sold south. Pharaoh or Satan signified slave owners, or indeed anyone who mistreated the slave. The slaves referred to themselves as the Israelites. Patrollers were Pharaoh's army. Jesus or King Jesus referred to anyone who had the slave's interest at heart. Obtaining freedom was crossing the Jordan River, which might actually be a reference to the Ohio River. The Promised Land might refer to Africa, the North, Canada, Canaan, or heaven. And so, while they knew that talking openly and plainly about freedom and liberation and equality would end up getting them in trouble with their slave owners, they knew that speaking in code was something that the white people would often miss. They wouldn't recognize how the code was speaking to them. And then they could also use these songs in ways that would communicate different plans of how they could escape and find actual freedom and liberation from their white slave owners. But then after the Civil War ends, you then have these black slaves who are now being able to come out from hiding. They're able to start working through these wounds that they've carried in their bodies. And one of the ways they began to do that was through church communities. Because in a book called My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies, Resmaa Menakem says that this PTSD that a lot of Black people have struggled with, they began to move through and heal through in exercises such as humming, rocking, rhythmic clapping, drumming, singing, grounding touch, wailing circles, call and response. You could see how Black churches could provide a really great opportunity for them weekly to get together and to pursue healing in community from the wounds their bodies were bearing under the weight of slavery. But as they began to be more visible in their worship, and they began to express themselves in these physical ways, white people started becoming very afraid. They started condemning Black worship as savage, as out of control. As Black Christians were starting to express themselves with instruments, they started producing what would eventually become rock and roll music. And then white Christians, on the other hand, in order to respond to that, would call that savage. And they would start to spread ideas that Black worship and rock and roll was satanic, that it was created by witch doctors in Africa. I was always told this growing up, that basically God has set forth this created order of musical rhythm where a measure of a music should biblically be emphasized as 1, 2, 3, 4. But basically, the African witch doctors rebelled against God's created order by emphasizing the second and fourth beats of a measure of music, like 1, 2, 3, 4. And of course, this is completely ridiculous. But they basically said that this 2/4 beat was a way of mimicking the rhythm of sex, which of course was evil. And we were told that basically all of this music is sexual and satanic, and it all goes back to the African witch doctors. And so you're demonizing this Black worship tradition as satanic and over-sexualized. So Leah Payne talks about how, especially Southern whites, she says they would argue that the sounds they produced, for example, organ music, were holier and more moral than the sounds that African American influenced music produced, for example, drums. And that perfectly matches the experience I had in the independent Baptist churches growing up. Those were the exact same arguments that I heard. And so the problem then becomes you end up having these two traditions, because eventually the white Christians were filled with a lot of fear about the end times, about the sexual revolution, and the state of their young people. And so eventually they gave in and allowed contemporary music to be utilized in order to attract the young people, in order to save the young people from the threats against their souls, from their theology. And so you end up getting these worlds here of CCM, contemporary Christian music, being primarily a white context, and gospel music being a Black context. And so even though slavery is done, even though segregation has ended, the worship industry is essentially segregated into CCM and gospel music. And you can begin to see some of these worlds combining in the mid-2000s, where there were a number of Black artists like Lecrae who were getting popular in the Reformed world of John Piper and the Gospel Coalition. And a lot of these white theologians and pastors would utilize these Black rappers in ways that would communicate, we're not racist because we have our Black rapper, we have our Black friend. But then when Lecrae started defending Black Lives Matter, suddenly people stopped showing up to his shows. And suddenly people started having an issue with him. Kirk Franklin, during the 2016 Dove Awards, he won the award for Best Gospel Artist. And on the stage, he said, I have a lot of friends in this room of many shades and colors that I have walked a life for the last 23 years with. Great men and women in the contemporary Christian community. When police are killed, we need to say something. When Black boys are killed, we need to say something. And when we don't say something, we're saying something. And then he led the audience in a prayer for repentance. But unfortunately, it didn't air because the Trinity Broadcasting Network cut the section out. You remember TBN is actually the station that we just mentioned last week that hosted the TPUSA halftime show with Kid Rock. From all the white people who were upset about the Bad Bunny Spanish-speaking halftime show. So then in 2019, Franklin wins the Best Gospel Artist again, and he prays a prayer for the family of Tatiana Jefferson, who was fatally shot inside of her home by a white police officer. And again, TBN edited his speech. And so finally, Franklin decided that he was going to boycott TBN. And he said, quote, "For so long, the musical terms Christian and gospel for many are code words for white and black, which history may teach us was a setup for this unfortunate place we find ourselves in today. Not only did they edit my speech, they edited the African American experience." So you have these two different traditions. The white world of CCM, the black world of gospel. And within the white world of CCM, you have this organization called CCLI. CCLI is the organization that licenses Christian music that is sung on Sunday mornings. And so churches can sign up for CCLI, then they report which songs they displayed lyrics for, and then the money that CCLI collects from the churches can then get distributed to the songwriters. So CCLI was formed not in the world of gospel music, it was formed in the world of CCM, which again is a primarily white world. And to give you an idea of how much money we're talking about here, one insider that I quote in my book said just in the United States, just out of these white evangelical churches largely that subscribe to this license who reported their usages, if a song is at number one, that's about $1 million a year to that publisher and that songwriter. Then the insider said, you extrapolate that over the time it takes to reach number one and the time it takes to fall off the face of the earth, there's a lot of money there. But notice how that insider framed this as just out of these white evangelical churches that subscribe to this license. Unfortunately, because this was put together in the primarily white world of CCM, black churches are not largely signed up for CCLI. And so as a result, while white worship songwriters are making millions of dollars on songs that are being sung on Sunday morning, black gospel songwriters are not having their songs reported to CCLI, and thus they're making virtually nothing. One insider I quote said about a popular gospel artist, they said, he is sung in every black church in this country, every one of them, just all black churches. Unless it's on the radio, he's not getting paid for that record. He's not getting paid for the usage of the church. That's because the church isn't signed up for CCLI. If the church was signed up for CCLI, then he could get paid, but he can't get paid because there's no recording of that usage to pay him. You can understand here why black churches would be hesitant to sign up for an organization that was built in the world of the segregated white worship world. It makes total sense. But also, black Christians weren't the ones who created this power dynamic to begin with. As I've traced throughout this episode, this is going back through this past century and a half from hierarchies that white Christians created of race and ethnicity that kept black people separate from having to sing in their cabins under wash bins to their own separate communities and eventually to their own separate demonized music world. But where we're at here at this point is, okay, they could make music on radio. But at an institute on worship that I attended last year, the black rapper Propaganda said that basically even Christian radio has an issue here, because he said he's been told directly to his face by program directors, you're my favorite artist, we'll just never play your music. Because he said Christian syndication, it's supposed to be safe. It's not supposed to be Christian. It's supposed to be safe. You have to make safe music for the person controlling the radio station. Safe for the whole family. That's the tagline. And so the white worship industry will allow some black and brown people into it, but you have to be black and brown people that the white industry decision makers deem to be safe for the white family and the white radio station owners. So unfortunately, we have a bit of a mess on our hands. And in my book, I go through a lot more detail than just what we've shared here. And so if you want to learn more about it, I would highly recommend pre-ordering the book when that's available. It's not available yet, but if you follow me on social media or subscribe on Substack, I will get that link out when Broadleaf has that set up. But these are conversations that we really need to have because we have an oligarchy that is forming in our nation politically and economically, but it's also in the worship industry, in the church. We have an oligarchy that's forming as well. And it's bringing in millions of dollars and funneling it to white, mostly male songwriters. And it's leaving a lot of Black Christians and women, which is a different conversation than what we're dealing with today with Black History Month. It's leaving them with very little money. And whether you think worship should be something that is commodified is one conversation, but songwriters should be able to get paid for their work. And when they're getting paid, we shouldn't have a system that is paying white people a bunch of money and paying Black people hardly any. These are issues that the church needs to deal with. This is what it means when we talk about things like systemic racism. This is not the result of one person making a decision to pay a white person and not pay a Black person. And that person just needs to be punished in hell forever, or Jesus taking their punishment on the cross and somehow that solves the situation. This is an entire systemic issue here that has been set up over the past century and a half that is causing a lot of harm. And it's something that has not only been reflected in our lyrics and the songs and the worship lyrics that we write, but it's also affecting financial injustice as well, based off of racial hierarchies that can be traced all the way back to the Civil War. These are conversations we need to start having. I'm going to have a lot more detail in the book that comes out later this year, Weapons of Worship, How the Songs of Evangelicalism Form the Soundtrack of Extremism. I appreciate you listening. That's it for today. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.